Next up, I'm very pleased to say we have a woman who has literally devoted her life to trying to raise the awareness about one of the most horrific and comprehensive forms of human rights abuse imaginable. And that is something that we've coined a term for: the womb police. The enforcement of the one child or two child or some child limit that the Chinese Communist Party and a few others, I must say, have been using to horrific effect, now of a great and terrible demographic consequence for their own people. Her name is Reggie Littlejohn. She is a lawyer by training, but has become the president of a marvelous organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. Reggie, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Brian Kennedy. Thank you for the committee on the present danger for having this event, which is extremely important, extremely timely, particularly at this juncture in history. And I am honored to speak about one of the most egregious instances of the CCP's unrestricted war against freedom, the coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy. Over the past 39 years, China has waged a war against women. The CCP has functioned as womb police, declaring life or death over every pregnancy in China. They claim that they have prevented 400 million births. Now that number, 400 million, is greater than the entire population of the United States and the entire population of Canada combined. How did they prevent these births? Through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and even infanticide. The coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy is the greatest violation of women's rights, and indeed the greatest violation of human rights on the earth today and in the history of the world, simply because of the massive numbers involved. It has been estimated that 65 million people died as a result of Mao Zedong's creation of a socialist China through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and other means. This number is mind-numbing, and it makes him the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. Yet even that number is eclipsed by the 400 million lives prevented by the one-child policy. So I would add to that 65 million, 400 million. So you got 465 million deaths due to the Chinese Communist Party. The two-child policy has not stopped this slaughter. The new rule is every couple is allowed to have 2 children. What does that mean in practice? That means you have to be married. You have to be part of a couple in order to have a child. So that leaves single women still at risk of forced abortion, and third pregnancies also have been forcibly aborted. Now, there have been a whole series of unintended consequences that have caused immeasurable suffering in China and falling like a series of dark dominoes as a result of the one-child policy. Number one, forced abortion. This has continued even since the two-child policy was instituted on January 1st of 2016. In November of 2018, NPR reported that there was a Kazakh woman who was forcibly aborted of her 3rd child. What happened is this. She was marrying somebody in Kazakhstan. She wanted to give up her Chinese citizenship. She crossed the border into China. To give up her Chinese citizenship, they discovered she was pregnant with a 3rd child. That's legal in Kazakhstan, but not in China. So they forcibly aborted her 3rd child. November 2018. Forced sterilization. What do I mean by forced sterilization? As Frank mentioned, I am an attorney. I was practicing law in San Francisco. I represented a Chinese refugee in her case for political asylum. She was persecuted as a Christian and also forcibly sterilized. In her case, what it meant was that cadres came to her door daily trying to convince her to be sterilized. She refused because people in her village would have their entire health ruined by these sterilizations. So finally, they just physically picked her up, carried her out of her home screaming and crying, held her down to a table, cut her open, tied her fallopian tubes. This is all without anesthesia. And as a result, they ruined her health. She had chronic back pain, chronic migraines, chronic abdominal pain for the rest of her life, or at least until I represented her, which was many years later. Okay, so forced abortion, forced sterilization, unintended consequences, gendercide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. China has had the worst sex ratio of any country in the world, and it has not stopped under the two-child policy. In fact, in some ways, it's almost become worse. We don't have the next, they're going to have another census in 2020, so we don't have the current numbers, but I will tell you an incident. This was in Anhui province in July 2017, so this was under the two-child policy. A couple had a daughter. They were fine. They were satisfied. We have our kid. Along comes the two-child policy in 2017, and then the idea is, oh, wait, we have a girl, let's get a boy. The husband forced his wife to abort 4 baby girls in a year. When she became ill, he divorced her, and then she died. And I can tell you many other instances of gendercide that have happened. This is the thing. Even under the two-child policy, there's son preference. We can go into that if you want to ask a question about why. But people will let their if the first kid is a girl, they'll let her live. But then they're saying, oh, but we can have a boy on the second child. So second daughters are still very vulnerable to sex-selective abortion. That has led to a gender imbalance where there are now an estimated 37 million more men than women living in China. And that has led to human trafficking and sexual slavery. So, for example, in the June 2018 Trafficking in Persons report put out by our State Department, China was listed as a Tier 3 nation, one of the worst offenders in the world. How do you get to be a Tier 3 nation? Number one, you have to have a terrible record on human trafficking, and number two, you need to not be doing anything about it or not enough about it, okay? Why does China not take more action against human trafficking? Could it be the 37 million quote-unquote excess males that they have? What are they going to do with all these frustrated men if they don't have trafficked women? It's really a sick calculation that they're making. And by the way, I know that something that is important to Frank and me, and I think everybody here, what are they going to do with the 37 million excess males? Does this pose some kind of international security risk? Wouldn't it be convenient to put them in the military? Okay, so China made an adjustment from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. The entire infrastructure of coercion is still in place to enforce the two-child policy, and they did it not because they were repenting of their human rights violations. No, they did it because they're facing a demographic disaster. Their workforce has decreased. They're facing a senior tsunami, and they're in such a difficult situation right now with respect to seniors that over the last 20 years, senior suicide has skyrocketed 500%. Why is that? Because the one-child policy has destroyed the family structure of China. They used to have large families. It was not a problem to help the seniors as they got old. Now they have small families. There's no one left to take care of grandma and grandpa, especially grandma. When grandpa dies, there's just... China has the highest female suicide rate in the world. Also, 590 women a day kill themselves in China. In the Chinese countryside, 3 times the number of women as men kill themselves. And seniors, and especially senior widows, are killing themselves. All right. He says I have to finish up. So why does China continue with any kind of coercive enforcement of population control when they need more babies? Okay. I believe it's social control masquerading as population control. The one-child policy touches everyone in China, and it is an instrument of terror. The womb police function as domestic terrorists. So what can we do about it? Number one, Women's Rights Without Frontiers is the only organization in the world that has boots on the ground inside of China, actively saving baby girls and abandoned widows. Number two, we can keep up the pressure, the international pressure. The CCP said that international criticism was one of the reasons they are thinking about abandoning coercive birth control. And then number three, we can use the Global Magnitsky Act, which authorizes the U.S. government to sanction human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and ban them from entering the United States. And I think that this is a great way to send a message to China that we're not going to take this anymore. Thank you.
Would there be a question for Reggie Littlejohn? Marion?
Thank you, Reggie. Could you speak just briefly about how the party or how the government presents this policy? Obviously, there's a lot about the techniques, the consequences of the policy that they don't admit, they don't acknowledge. But in terms of public statements or the general public, how do they defend this policy? How do they present it as a social good?
Well, I mean, typically what they will do, and they've changed their rhetoric over the last couple of years because they've had to, but what they have said is, look at us. We have 1.4 billion people. We have just too big of a population. We need to be able to control it. Well, yes, they have the biggest population in the world, and yes, their population is growing. You want to know why it's growing? Because the seniors are living longer. It's the elderly that are growing. And they don't address the fact that they need more of a young population to support the elderly population, and they need more girls. Now they have realized that actually that this is the case, and they're desperate for babies. And this is just another form of coercion, trying to force people. Every couple that is allowed to have 2 children must have 2 children. I mean, they're pressuring people to have babies when they don't want them. But the last thing I want to say is this: I believe that China is going to announce either that they're moving to a 3-child policy or that that they will allow all couples to have as many children as they want. Watch the language. Because if they say all couples are allowed to have as many children as they want, that still leaves single women open to forced abortion, and it still leaves the entire infrastructure in place. They need to be saying everyone can have as many kids as they want, not just all couples. Thank you.
Really good.